Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I heard about half of it, but I trust that it was all kind to me, so thank you. I do appreciate. I want to start off by saying that, I truly do feel privileged to be here this afternoon. Want to express my gratitude to Ana Muñez and the rest of her team at the Spanish Anti-Doping Agency for inviting me to take part in this symposium. I had the pleasure of meeting Ana on her visit to the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency offices earlier this year, and could not have been more impressed with her drive and determination to make the Spanish Anti-Doping Agency a world leader among anti-doping agencies or national anti-doping agencies. Now that I have had the opportunity to come here, tour their offices, and meet with some of her colleagues, I have no doubt at all that they are up to the task that lies ahead of them. And certainly this symposium is a testament to their commitment to the anti-doping fight, and I look forward to a long and collaborative relationship with them or between our agencies. Sorry, getting a little bit ahead of myself there. So it's very humbling for me to be here to talk with you all. I started at USADA only 16 months ago. And when I walked through the door on my first day, I never imagined that my first year would include a role in exposing what USADA's CEO, Travis Tiger, refers to as, quote, the most sophisticated, professionalized, and successful doping program that sport has ever seen. Similarly, I never could have imagined that I would have the opportunity to share insights from our investigation with an audience like the one that's assembled here today. And because the public's interest and scrutiny in matters such as these are important because it forces those who work in anti-doping to be at our best, which is certainly a benefit to athletes and clean sport and true competition. The title of my presentation is Inside the USADA Cycling Investigation, and I hope in the brief time that we have today that you all will get a glimpse into USADA's handling of the U.S. Postal Service cycling team case, an investigation including the Lance Armstrong case. So I'd like to start the presentation by showing two short clips. The first is a compilation of statements made by Lance Armstrong over the course of his cycling career with regard to allegations of doping that were made against him.
Is there evidence? Where is evidence of doping here?
He insists he's never tested positive.
I said where I was 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
I have the facts on my side. Explain to me how we pass so many tests if we're so dirty.
We've opened ourselves up for investigation. We've opened ourselves up for inquiries. And our average, our batting average in all of them is 1,000.
Listen, I've said it for 7 years. I've said it for longer than 7 years. I have never doped. What they've done is they've written, as I said, they've written the conclusion, and then they've tried to fill in the rest with a house of cards and with speculation and with innuendo.
Yeah, we got nothing to hide. We know that. Everybody knows that. We've proven time in and time out that we're clean, and I can tell you that the controls today in cycling in 2004 are a hell of a lot more than they ever were before.
I mean, I came out of a life-threatening disease. I was on my deathbed. Do you think I'm going to come back into a sport and say, okay, doctor, give me everything you got. I just want to go fast? No way. Would never do that.
So I don't need it to say in a contract you're fired if you test positive. That's not as important as losing the support of hundreds of millions of people.
But listen, nobody believes in doping controls more than me. I've submitted to all of them, whether in competition or out of competition.
Now, We can look at other biological markers in the blood and in the urine, and you can really prove that you're clean.
I know what I know, and I know what I do, and I know what I did, and that's not going to change.
If he didn't win the tour, someone else that was doped would have won the tour in every single one of those tours.
It's his word versus ours. We like our word. We like where we stand. We like our credibility.
The truth of the matter is that I've been indicted in the media. There's a lot of stuff going on besides what might be written in the press or might be speculated.
So I know that was pretty fast. I apologize to the interpreter. I hope that you all got the gist of what I was trying to convey with that clip, which was that Mr. Armstrong, throughout his career, was not only denied allegations of engaging in doping activity, but he did so very defiantly. And so the next clip I want to show is I believe it's Mr. Armstrong's most recent public appearance, once again discussing the allegations of doping. This is from earlier this year on a program. I'm not sure how big of a star she is. She's a huge star in the United States, but he appeared on a program with Oprah Winfrey, and so this is another brief clip.
So let's start with the questions that people around the world have been waiting for you to answer. And for now, I'd just like a yes or a no.
Okay.
Okay? This whole conversation, we have a lot of time, will be about the details. Yes or no, did you ever take banned substances to enhance your cycling performance?
Yes.
Yes or no, was one of those banned substances EPO?
Yes.
Did you ever blood dope or use blood transfusions to enhance your cycling performance?
Yes.
Did you ever use any other banned substances like testosterone, cortisone, or human growth hormone?
Yes.
Yes or no? In all 7 of your Tour de France victories, did you ever take banned substances or blood dope?
Yes.
So after seeing those 2 clips, I think the question that comes to my mind is, what happened? What happened to bring a change in a man who so consistently and defiantly during his entire career denied doping? And the slightly more complicated answer to that question of what happened is what I plan to cover today. So one of the most common questions that the public ask USADA is, when did the U.S. Postal Team investigation start? The transformation from suspicion to active inquiry can be somewhat difficult to pinpoint, but certainly there were clear indications, going back several decades, that there was a doping problem in cycling. And USADA was personally involved in 2 prosecutions for doping activity in cycling in the 2000s. The first was Tyler Hamilton, shown here with a gold medal from I believe that's the Athens Olympics. Tyler Hamilton tested positive as a result of a blood sample he provided in September of 2004. Analysis of that blood sample showed that there were mixed blood cell population in the blood, which indicated the use of homologous blood transfusion, meaning he had transfused someone else's blood, impermissibly transfused someone else's blood into his body. He had an interesting defense, which was the chimera from the vanishing twin defense, basically saying that there was a twin that in the womb with him, and that twin was somehow absorbed into him at some point. I don't really know all the science behind it. I'm not sure the experts who were testifying on his behalf really knew all the science behind it, but it was not accepted by the arbitrator, and he ended up serving a 2-year period of ineligibility. The other athlete whose prosecution USADA was involved in, Floyd Landis, tested positive at the 2006 Tour de France and was stripped of his title. Subsequently came forward and was honest about his doping activities, but for years, both Tyler and Floyd maintained that they were innocent and that they had been unfairly branded as cheaters due to bad science and overzealous prosecution by USADA. They appealed to the public for assistance and were both able to raise substantial sums of money to fund their defenses. But in the end, they were unable to overcome the overwhelming evidence against both of them, and they both ended up serving 2-year periods of ineligibility. In 2010, Floyd came forward and publicly admitted for the first time that he had been doping and that he had doped at the 2006 Tour de France, and as well as throughout a large portion of his professional cycling career. And that would include part of his time on the U.S. Postal Service cycling team. Floyd's decision to come forward and reverse years of denials was certainly a defining moment in USADA's investigation into doping in the sport of cycling. Because he not only spoke about his own doping activities, but he also implicated, several of his teammates, including Lance Armstrong, team doctors, trainer, and the team director, saying that they were all complicit and that they all knew about his doping activities. So Floyd came forward after serving out his full 2-year period of ineligibility. Thus, his decision was not motivated by a desire to get a reduction in his sanction. His sanction was over. In fact, it turns out that a large part of the reason why he came forward is he was simply tired of living a lie. But that didn't stop Radio Shack, those who he had accused of wrongdoing, from attacking him. This here is just a screen grab from a website about Landis coming forward about his doping activities and implicating others in that. And this is an article about how Team Radio Shack, where some of his former teammates and his former team director were employed at the time, had released a statement saying that he was just coming out with this at that time because he was bitter, had an axe to grind, and that's something that we came to find was very common. That was the playbook. They would just try to grind their accusers into the ground, grind them into dust, and dismiss them, and it worked. It worked for a long time. But the allegations presented by Floyd were then quickly confirmed by several others, and it demonstrated to us at USADA that we had not just uncovered doping by a single cyclist or even by a single cycling team, but that in looking into these matters, we were shining a light on a culture of corruption that had permeated the entire sport for far too long. Although Floyd's admission pushed USADA's investigation of doping in professional cycling into high gear, USADA voluntarily suspended its investigation in deference to a federal investigation by the United States federal government into some of the allegations that Floyd had made. The purpose of the federal investigation was to determine whether the U.S. Postal Service's team had committed any criminal acts in the course of carrying out its doping program. And the investigation lasted for approximately 2 years. It appeared that an indictment was imminent. Then, in February of last year, the U.S. Attorney's Office announced that they were dropping the investigation, and that announcement was made without any prior notice with very little explanation. This right here is a screenshot of the statement that was released by the U.S. Attorney's Office. As you see, it's 3 paragraphs, very short on details. I don't need to read it out, but it just pretty much announces that they're closing it, no explanation provided. So, not surprisingly, Lance Armstrong framed the news that he was not going to be indicted and that the investigation had been closed by the federal government as a victory, and he appeared confident that his legacy as a 7-time Tour de France champion was secure. And so this is a statement that he released, and I'll go ahead and read it real quickly. I am gratified to learn that the U.S. Attorney's Office is closing its investigation. Armstrong said it in a statement. It is the right decision, and I commend them for reaching it. I look forward to continuing my life as a father, a competitor, and an advocate in the fight against cancer without this distraction. USADA, meanwhile, vowed to continue its investigation into doping in cycling. And this is a statement from our CEO, Travis, that was released that same day, just explaining that although the criminal investigation had been closed, that the role of the government and the role of USADA are different. The government was looking into whether criminal acts had been committed, not whether doping had occurred, while we were looking to determine whether or not doping had occurred. And so that's a statement to that effect. During the federal investigation, Lance Armstrong had welcomed the prospect of USADA looking into the claims, investigating the claims that had been made against him by Floyd Landis. This is a tweet that he sent out in January of 2011, I believe. So that was right during the heart of the federal investigation. And it says, "Great to hear that USADA is investigating some of Sports Illustrated's claims. I look forward to being vindicated." So he'd actually welcomed us to take a closer look at what was going on and to investigate these claims, which we were only too happy to do. Of course, his stance did change after the federal investigation closed, and he became once again very defiant and very combative when questioned or about his role in the doping program with the U.S. Postal or about his own doping activities. USADA's mission is to preserve the integrity of competition, inspire true sport, and protect the rights of clean athletes. And as the information about doping on the U.S. Postal team was coming in, USADA had an obligation to pursue the evidence and ensure that the truth about the pervasive nature of doping in cycling was revealed. But USADA was not alone in this obligation. The International Cycling Union, or UCI, also had a responsibility to fully investigate the claims against Armstrong and the U.S. Postal Service team. This is an excerpt from the World Anti-Doping Code, Article 20.3.9. It's a section that applies to the roles and responsibilities of international federations. And this brief excerpt says that it is their role and responsibility to vigorously pursue all potential anti-doping rule violations within its jurisdiction. Now, certainly, professional cyclists engaging in doping activity is a potential or reports, I should say, of cyclists engaging in doping activity is a potential anti-doping rule violation. So UCI had an obligation to fully investigate those claims. Unfortunately, in the past, professional cyclists who had come forward with information about their own doping activities or the doping activities of others had been attacked, they had been marginalized, they had been intimidated and pushed out of the sport. This is an article from the Washington Post in which Armstrong is calling a allegation of EPO use, rampant EPO use on the U.S. Postal Service's team, quote unquote, a hatchet job. And this is in response to, that was in response to Frank Andreu coming forward and being honest about his past experiences. Now, Armstrong's entitled. He doesn't have an obligation to follow up or to really say anything if anyone accuses him or his teammates of doping activity, but certainly the UCI had an obligation to look into that. And here was their response. This is Pat McQuaid in September of 2006 saying, quote, "If Andreu wishes to say that, that's up to him. I don't know what he's trying to achieve because he cannot achieve anything by saying this." So that's the head of UCI saying that someone who's coming forward with information about doping in professional cycling cannot achieve anything by coming forward with that information. That's a chilling statement. Floyd Landis came forward with his information, mentioned this earlier, in 2010. In response to that, Pat McQuaid, once again, asked, what's his agenda? The guy is seeking revenge. It's sad. It's sad for cycling. It's obvious he does hold a grudge. These guys coming out now with things like this from the past is only damaging the sport. If they've any love for the sport, they wouldn't do it. So this actually goes a step further. Not only is he saying that nothing will be accomplished by coming forward with this type of information, he's saying that doing so is actually damaging the sport. And once again, implicitly encouraging people with information about doping and cycling to stay quiet about that information. Last one. This is in response to, I believe, Tyler Hamilton coming forward with allegations, or with his confession and allegations about doping on the U.S. Postal Service team. And he says, Hein Verbruggen, former head of UCI, says, that's impossible because there is nothing. I repeat again, Lance Armstrong has never used doping. Never, never, never. And I say this not because I am a friend of his, I say it because I'm sure. So, again, this is 3 instances where individuals came forward with information about doping activity in the sport of cycling, and the powers that be did absolutely nothing about it. And not wanting you all to think that this is something that just occurred in the past, skipping ahead in the presentation a little bit, but after USADA released its reasoned decision, UCI had an opportunity to review those findings and decide whether or not they were going to appeal the decision. They decided ultimately that they would not appeal the decision. That announcement was made on October 22nd, 2012. Now, and that was made at a press conference on that date. At the same press conference, or after it, I should say, during a Q&A session or a candid moment during an interview, Pat McQuaid had this to say about Hamilton and Landis, the 2 individuals who had come forward and really helped provide some momentum to this investigation. He said, they are scumbags. All they have done is damage to the sport. So this is still as recently as October of 2012, this is still an issue, you know, and it's really unfortunate. So in our opinion, the prior admissions were never properly followed up on by UCI because they believed that any revelations about a doping culture in the sport would prove damaging to the sport, as you saw from those statements, and to the bottom line. It would cost them money. So in order to build a case, it was essential for USADA to reverse the trend of attacking those individuals who came forward and were courageous enough to admit their past transgressions, and instead focus on exposing the doping culture in the sport, as well as those individuals in the sport who had enabled and encouraged the doping behavior. And here you'll see the postal team support personnel, 3 doctors, a trainer, and the team director. These are the types of individuals who we believe actually perpetuate this system, this culture of doping, and we feel that these are the individuals that you have to remove from the sport in order to really get any traction on these anti-doping efforts. So simply put, our goal was to dismantle the system of corruption. We believe to a certain extent that the athletes themselves were victims, that they were victims of a corrupt system, and don't want to make excuses for them. They had to be held accountable for the decisions that they had made. They succumbed to temptations and they doped, and not everyone did dope. So those who did certainly had to face the consequences of that action or those actions, but they were certainly less culpable than these individuals who were leaders in the sport, who were encouraging this type of behavior. And again, that's the doctors, the team owners, the trainers, and other leaders in the sport. So what USADA did is we set to give athletes who are victims to a certain extent of this corrupt culture a chance to come in and be truthful about their past experiences. By doing that, we were allowed to focus our prosecutions, or it was our hope that we'd be able to focus our prosecutions on individuals like these individuals on the screen before you. To date, we have brought 5 cases, or cases against 5 individuals in the system, including the 3 doctors, Dr. Pedro Celaya, Dr. Luis Garcia del Moral, and Dr. Michele Ferrari. Also brought a case against the trainer for U.S. Postal, Jose Pepe Marti, and against the team director, Johan Brunil. We feel it's a good start, but we're also confident that there's more to come. There's a lot of information out there that has not come out yet. But we are confident that if the anti-doping agencies remain engaged in this process, that additional support personnel will be held accountable for their actions. So in reaching out to the athletes, we made every effort possible to demonstrate that we understood why they chose to dope, that we recognized there were powerful temptations and pressures that led them and an entire generation of athletes to come to the conclusion that the only way to compete was to take dangerous drugs in order to make themselves competitive. And that breaking the code of silence, or the omerta, was something that many of them regarded as a betrayal, or a kind of betrayal, to their friends and former teammates. It was also important for us to understand and acknowledge the athletes' fears. After years of lying, the athletes understandably feared the reactions of their fans, their friends, their family members, and also the reaction of the media, how they would be portrayed in the media. They also feared the possibility of being locked out of the sport, blacklisted, and losing their ability to make a living. The loss of reputation and being viewed as a fraud were also legitimate concerns. However, in my opinion, the most important fear that we had to overcome was the athlete's fear that they were going to be exposed and that nothing was going to change in the sport, that they were going to come forward, tell their stories, and either USADA wasn't going to do anything with that information, or we were just going to sanction them, hold them out as dopers, and do nothing else. So that's something that it was important for us to overcome. But once we had sufficiently established a level of understanding with regard to the initial motivations to dope, as well as their fears related to the public disclosure of their past misdeeds, we then worked to identify and emphasize to the athlete the benefits of coming forward and being truthful about their doping histories. In this instance, several of the athletes who came forward received 6-month period of ineligibility, those athletes that were still actively competing. And there's no question, which is a reduction by 75% from the standard 2-year period of ineligibility. And there's no question that the possibility of a reduced sanction is the most important consideration for some athletes who are facing a lengthy suspension. However, for many other athletes, and especially those athletes who are no longer competing, the ability to reclaim their reputation in the eyes of the public, in the eyes of the sport, in the eyes of their fans, in the eyes of their family, is just as important. In addition, the opportunity to be regarded not as a cheater, but as a champion for truth is something that's appealing as well. To be seen as someone who took advantage of the opportunity to do the right thing, not just for his own benefit, but for the benefit of the sport and future generation of athletes, is something that I believe was important to many of the athletes who came forward and were truthful about their experiences in their doping experiences in professional cycling. Now, this is a letter which we sent to Mr. Armstrong's attorneys after several phone calls with his lawyers, in which we invited him to come and meet with us to be a part of this solution. Here's a brief excerpt from there. It says, "I hope in the interest of our efforts to obtain the truth and in order to protect the interests of clean athletes and the integrity of competition that Mr. Armstrong will decide to meet with us." Now, this was the same opportunity that we gave to all of the other riders who we contacted. But Mr. Armstrong was the only one who rejected our invitation and instead went on the attack. This is the response letter from his attorney. It says, in part, "We will not be a party to this charade. Lance has publicly and repeatedly made clear that he never doped, and his avowals, unlike the words of the witnesses whose testimony USADA has bought and paid for, are supported by an unblemished, decades-long record." Now, the athletes who took us up on our invitation to be a part of the solution included some of the most recognizable names in cycling. There's Michael Berry, who was a teammate of Lance Armstrong's for 4 years, from 2002 through 2005. He testified that he was provided banned substances by U.S. Postal Team doctors and staff, and that throughout his tenure with the U.S. Postal, and then the U.S. Postal turned into the Discovery Cycling Team, that the use of performance-enhancing drugs by the cyclist was well known and encouraged by the team leadership. Tom Danielson, he was a teammate of Lance Armstrong's for 1 season in 2005, worked with Dr. Ferrari, and was supplied drugs by the team. He testified that He recounted being put on a doping program for the first time in advance of a race that was actually here in Spain. And, his experiences were echoed by many others. Tyler Hamilton, we've already discussed his history, but he was a teammate of Lance Armstrong's for 4 seasons and was actually introduced to Dr. Ferrari by Mr. Armstrong. Jonathan Vaughters, teammate of Mr. Armstrong's for 2 seasons from 1998 through 1999, currently the team director for Garmin Slipstream, discussed drug use with Mr. Armstrong and who seemed to have information on how the test operated, the EPO detection test operated in the early 2000s. Levi Leipheimer, teammate of Lance Armstrong for 5 seasons, 2001 through 2002, and then after Mr. Armstrong returned to competition from 2009 through 2011. He also was introduced to Dr. Ferrari by Mr. Armstrong, and Lance, or Mr. Armstrong, told Levi in 2009 that he had continued to work with Dr. Ferrari, even though he had publicly distanced himself from Dr. Ferrari several years earlier. He told Levi that relationship had in fact endured. Floyd Landis, we've also touched on him before, teammate of Lance Armstrong for 3 seasons from 2002 through 2004, won the 2006 Tour de France, but lost the title after testing positive for testosterone. He actually received testosterone from Armstrong on occasion back in 2002 and recounted several instances where he personally witnessed Mr. Armstrong and other U.S. Postal Service athletes and support personnel engage in doping activity. Frankie Andreu overheard Mr. Armstrong acknowledge the use of EPO, testosterone, human growth hormone, steroids, and cortisone in October of 1996 as he was undergoing treatment for cancer. Mr. Andreu and his wife were attacked by Mr. Armstrong for several years for being truthful about witnessing that conversation take place between Mr. Armstrong and his physicians. He was a teammate of Mr. Armstrong's for parts of 9 seasons from 1992 through 96, and then again from 1998 through 2002. David Zabriskie, teammates of Lance Armstrong for 4 seasons, recounted several instances where doping activity was personally witnessed by him amongst riders and support personnel on the U.S. Postal Service team, was actually introduced to doping by support personnel, and it was probably one of the more heartbreaking testimonies that we took because Mr. Zabriskie told us that he had gotten involved in cycling as an escape from a difficult home life, and his father had actually died from drug addiction. And so when he was put in a position and encouraged by the people who he trusted to look after his well-being to actually start doping and take these dangerous substances that had led to his father's death, it was a very difficult and emotional thing for him to deal with at the time, and even as he was recounting it to us. He told us that after that first incident where he used performance-enhancing drugs, he went back to his hotel room and just cried because it was just so painful for him to have arrived at that place in this sport that had previously been something of a safe haven for him. Christian Vandevelde, teammate of Lance Armstrong's for 5 seasons, 1998 through 2003, was recounted being berated by Armstrong for not, quote, being with the program, so to speak, and not taking the doping as seriously as he should have. Recounted that Armstrong indicated that his good standing on the team was dependent on him using performance-enhancing drugs. So it's not just a matter of the best rider on the team or the most famous rider on the team leading by example, or this is an incident of outright intimidation in order to get one of his teammates to go along with what the rest of the team was doing. And George Hincapie, a teammate of Lance Armstrong for 11 seasons, the only cyclist who was with Mr. Armstrong for all 7 of his Tour de France victories. He testified that he was a client of Michele Ferrari and that he was on a blood doping program from 2001 through 2005, and that he had personally witnessed doping activity on the U.S. Postal Cycling Team. So, without a doubt, the most compelling evidence that was collected during our investigation and ultimately presented, publicly made available in our reasoned decision was the sworn testimony of 26 witnesses, including 11 former teammates of Mr. Armstrong's. The one teammate who is not on this slide it was a teammate of Armstrong's prior to him joining the U.S. Postal Service's team. But he also testified that he had discussions with Mr. Armstrong about performance-enhancing drugs and how they needed to be on performance-enhancing drugs, using them in order to be competitive. Almost without exception, these riders testified that although it was painful, that telling the truth was tremendously unburdening and a transformative experience. And it's important to keep in mind that for each of these witnesses, telling the truth was potentially very costly. In uncovering the secrets of doping on the U.S. Postal Service's team, these individuals were implicating themselves. They were all certain to lose competitive results and titles, and they risked the loss of their employment in cycling as well. And one of the riders, which was Levi Leipheimer, all the way to the left, third row, the risk of losing a job became a reality. Shortly after his involvement in the U.S. Postal Service's team doping program, he was unceremoniously terminated from his contract with the Omega Pharma Quick Step cycling team. And although he was still very competitive at the time of his termination, and committed to returning to competition after his sanction expired, Levi was unable to find a team for the 2013 season, and actually reportedly announced earlier this week that he had retired from cycling as a result of that. Apart from the financial and career ramifications, the fear of retaliation, there were emotional risks as well of telling the truth. There were a lot of expectations and inertia that comes with having lied to the public and reporters, fans, spouses, children, parents, and other family members over the years. And coming clean after all that time was something that a lot of the cyclists really struggled with. And for many of the riders, such as Tyler Hamilton, they made the decision when they started doping to keep that from their family members, to keep it a secret from those who they were closest to. And so for Tyler, one of the most difficult moments he experienced was actually telling his mother and his father that he had lied to them for all those years. Yet, despite the difficulty of that moment, Tyler is adamant that coming clean and telling the truth was the best thing he ever did. And that bringing his secrets out into the open actually allowed him to start over in his relationships and begin anew. So after Lance Armstrong turned down USADA's invitation for a meeting, USADA provided him as well as the other respondents with the notice of the anti-doping violations alleged against them. Shortly thereafter, each of the respondents was formally charged with the commission of various anti-doping rule violations during the course of their careers, and most specifically during their tenures with the U.S. Postal Service cycling team and Discovery cycling team. Dr. Ferrari and Dr. Del Moral failed to contest the charges lodged against them and were sanctioned with lifetime bans for their transgressions. Johan Brunel, Pepe Marti, and Dr. Celea requested arbitration hearings to contest the charges. That arbitration is still ongoing. Can't really speak to it other than that. Lance Armstrong went a different route. He sued USADA in federal court, brought a lawsuit in order to prevent us from moving forward with the case and imposing a sanction on him for the alleged doping offenses. The lawsuit ultimately failed to sway the opinion of the judge, and this is actually the order from the federal judge, Sam Sparks, dismissing or granting USADA's motion to dismiss the lawsuit. And this was granted on August 20th of last year. 4 days later, one of Armstrong's claims was that there were two main claims. One was that USADA did not have jurisdiction over his case, and the second was that USADA should not be able to proceed against him because the rules under which he would be required to arbitrate did not provide him with the necessary due process. And the court, in dismissing the case, found that the USADA procedures do provide sufficient due process protections. And these are just a variety of different news reports related to that decision to dismiss. So 4 days later, after his lawsuit was dismissed, Mr. Armstrong announced that he would not contest the charges against him. And he released this statement. This statement was actually released to the media before it was made available to us, or before we had been advised that Mr. Armstrong would not be going to arbitration. And it's a bit lengthy, but I will try to touch on the main points. There comes a point in every man's life where he has to say, enough is enough. For me, that time is now. I've been dealing with claims that I cheated and had an unfair advantage in winning my 7 tours since 1999. Skip ahead. The toll this has taken on me, on my family, and my work for our foundation, and leads me to where I am today, finished with this nonsense. And then he goes on to say that he had hoped that the federal lawsuit would have gone his way, which it did not. So, after being advised that Mr. Armstrong would not go to arbitration to contest the charges against him, USADA imposed a sanction of a lifetime ban and loss of results going back to August of 1998. However, that sanction was not final and could not really go into place until the UCI and WADA had accepted our findings and declined to appeal the penalties. UCI made it clear that they would not make any determination on whether or not they planned to appeal until they were provided with all of the evidence which USADA had in its possession and uncovered during its investigation. And thus, in order to close out the case, USADA needed to make a report of that evidence in order to justify the severity of the sanction imposed on Mr. Armstrong and to a slightly lesser extent, Dr. Ferrari and Dr. Del Moral. That report was made in the form of the reasoned decision. The reasoned decision in the case of Lance Armstrong was published on October 10th, 2012. In its entirety, it contains over 1,000 pages of evidence, 26 sworn witness affidavits, sworn testimony from 11 writers. There's scientific evidence in there as well as financial evidence. The information was made available online at the same time that it was provided to the UCI and WADA. And since putting that information online, there have been over 400,000 unique visitors who have gone there to look at the reasoned decision or associated exhibits. And the reason why we wanted to do that was to ensure transparency in the process. And to ensure both in USADA's process in pulling that information together and also in UCI's consideration of that information. And after that information came out, public opinion had been initially very critical of USADA going after Mr. Armstrong, and the pendulum swung in the opposite direction. And these are just some of the cartoons that came out around that time. So this is a brief clip from Pat McQuaid. I'm not going to play it because time's running a little bit short, but in this clip he indicated that UCI had accepted the findings of USADA and that they would not be appealing the sanction. At that point, the lifetime ban went into place. Although Mr. Armstrong was stripped of his 7 Tour de France titles, WADA chose not to appeal a short time later, which finalized the process. And here's a brief quote from the WADA president, John Fahey. He says, "This case has resulted in a right and proper sanction for the athlete in question and has served as a revelation to the world of sport. For this, USADA must be applauded." And then the fallout from the reasoned decision coming out was pretty immediate and costly. Mr. Armstrong had previously had crossed the finish line first 7 times at the Tour de France, twice more than anyone in history. And in the course of his cycling career became one of the most recognizable athletes in the world. But within 2 weeks of the reasoned decision coming out, all of his major sponsors had left him. And by Mr. Armstrong's calculations, the loss of his sponsors cost him more than $75 million in future income. The loss of his 7 Tour de France titles also created a sizable void in that Grand Tour's record books. And if you look at this slide, this is after Armstrong's titles were stripped. Going back to 1996, there are only 3 riders who have not either had their titles stripped, or 3 winners of the Tour de France who have not had their titles stripped or otherwise been faced doping charges in their careers. And so that's just a very stark picture. And then perhaps one of the most encouraging outcomes of the Reasoned decision was that it put a spotlight on those riders who had resisted the urge to dope and were denied an opportunity to fair competition as a result. In addition to athletes like George Hincapie, Tyler Hamilton, David Zabriskie, who, when confronted with an opportunity to do the right thing, chose to do that for the good of the sport and be honest about their past doping experiences. There were many in the sport who never made the decision to break the rules to begin with. And today, those athletes, their integrity is intact, their reputations are intact, and their family reputations are intact. Today, those are the athletes who are being celebrated as the true winners of that time because they insisted on competing fairly. And this is one of those athletes, Scott Mercier. He's an Olympian and a former U.S. Postal Services team professional cyclist. I won't play this clip because of the time constraints, but I typically like to close with this clip because it perfectly sums up why it's so important to remain diligent to combat doping in sport. Mr. Mercier talks about how it was difficult for him to go away from sport, but to leave the sport behind when he saw the doping that was going on, but he felt it was the right decision for him. And that looking back on that decision now, he's so happy that he made it because he doesn't have to have those difficult conversations with his wife or with his kids that a lot of these other cyclists had to have, explaining to them that, yes, I made a decision to cheat, and now it's catching up with me. And so the Reasoned decision was an important accomplishment, but we still have work to do, which is why it is critically important that anti-doping agencies continue to work toward exposing doping in all sports, and just as important that the public keep the pressure on the powers that be to effect real and lasting change in order to make sure that a talented athlete never has to walk away from a sport that they love and a sport that they're good at because they're unwilling to put more than hard work and natural abilities into pursuing their ultimate goals. So I certainly appreciate your time and your attention to this matter. I'm not sure if there's time for questions. I guess we'll find out here soon, but thank you for your time.